Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's Saturday morning. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this is, I guess, what we'll still call McDonald in the morning, just because I like the alliteration and the consonants of that name, George. McDonald in the morning.
It does have a nice ring to it, yeah.
It does. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about Russia, and we're going to talk about the West. We're going to talk about why the West has become somewhat infatuated with Vladimir Putin, or elements of the West will say the left absolutely despises him. And without speaking for George, I will just preface by saying you are going to get a profound cautionary tale about what Russia has in plan and what the world would look like under Russian influence. So I'll begin, and it's not so much that I'm playing devil's advocate, George. It's more that I will freely admit I have been taken in by some of the rhetoric coming out of Russia, but I also recognize that most of it is in context to the dilapidating West and the insane anti-values we're promoting, the degenerative values and these sorts of things. So why don't you begin by telling us just a little bit about yourself and how you've come to know Russia the way you come to know it. Now I know you can now Finland is a border country with Russia, and you lived in Finland for a decade, right? So I'll stop
Yeah.
there and let you go.
Well, the people of Eastern Europe who have joined NATO reluctantly, they like their neutrality. They've been neutral for a long time.
Okay, I'm gonna stop you because sometimes you say things casually that are huge. It's like finding a sputter of oil on the ground. You want to drill in. So why would you say that the Eastern European countries who have joined NATO have done so reluctantly?
Well, because they liked being neutral. They really didn't want to be part of alliances either way. And to some extent, they didn't see the point of joining a larger alliance. For a long time, Finland traded, for example, quite even-handedly, and so did Sweden with the Warsaw countries and the NATO countries. Even while joining the EU, they didn't really look at that as a problem. So, as I said, they did it reluctantly because they liked the posture of being neutral, not wanting to get sucked into larger conflicts, for example. Sweden has been that way since, I think, 1820 something, the last time they were a member of any kind of a military alliance, if I recall correctly. So they got in there. And again, this kind of belies the Russian provocative message that anyone who opposes becoming an imperial subject of their growing empire is a quote fascist end quote, or a quote Nazi end quote. You won't find any of those really in Sweden or Finland.
Yeah.
I mean, there may be some fringe elements somewhere, just like we might have in Chicago, but that's probably less than 0.1% of the population that have those kind of leanings. Most are good old social democrats, Lutherans, et cetera, real middle of the road people used to decades of liberal socialism.
Yeah.
As I said, they're doing it reluctantly because they see what's happened since Putin.
Yeah. So that it's a little bit of a fear of Putin. Let's focus in on the Ukraine for a moment. What is your take on that country? And first of all, why is Ukraine so oft visited by bloodshed as a nation? Is there some sort of reason you can come up with?
It may be just being kind of at a crossroads point geographically, not having any natural barriers. The same reason Poland's been overrun by invasions, especially by Russia, by the Lithuanian and let's see, Swedish Confederacy at one time. I think they've been washed over by everybody, by Germany. Everyone's occupied Poland at one point or the other. So they've had the same kind of history, just kind of where you set to some extent.
Yeah.
I think has something to do with it. And there may be something epigenetically at work on the mass level, the mass basis. I was dealing with a couple of Ukrainian refugees recently in my practice as a healer, and I uncovered what I felt was probably epigenetic memories or cellular memory,
Yep.
because we're looking at people. I've run into this before with Jews, and I've run into it before with Armenians, because you have to remember there's an Armenian Holocaust at the hands of the Turks
Yep.
after World War One.
Yep.
I mean, 2/3 of the population of Armenians were just completely wiped out for no reason. And these memories are buried deeply in
Turk-
descendants.
The Turks have been very loath to own that as well. They
Oh,
deny
yeah, they absolutely deny it. So here was an empire trying to get rid of an inconvenient people, a Christian minority in their system. And the same way, I think empires tend to be built upon a mountain of corpses, any kind of empire, including the British and French empires.
Yep.
But in the case of Ukraine, so these people were obliterated. I think the population of Ukraine at the time was, if I recall, was well under 30 million. It was maybe 20 something million, and 8 million Ukrainians were starved to death systematically
Yeah.
by Russia between 1932 and 1933. And that's a conservative estimate. Nobody really knows the total number.
Yeah.
Their food supplies were taken, seized at gun and bayonet point.
Yeah.
Their fields were bombed. They actually used napalm on wheat fields to destroy the Ukrainian harvest.
Yeah.
After they had taken what they wanted out of it. It was absolutely bizarre. So millions of Ukrainians.
This is of course what history remembers as the Holodomor.
Holodomor, correct.
Which is,
so this was the first Holocaust.
now I it's not that I have ADHD, but I questions come up that are connected. So why, a slightly loaded question, and I don't mean to set you up or anything, but why are things like the Holodomor and the Armenian genocide sort of forgotten in history, and everything is dominated by the Holocaust that allegedly happened in World War II?
Well, I think it's very simple, and I'm not taking anything away from what the Jewish people suffered at various times, pogroms throughout history. That can't be denied. That happened, especially in Russia, actually.
Yeah.
That's the reason all those Jewish refugees were in Poland and Germany in the first place, is they had fled the Russian Empire during Tsarist days. They were not well treated. They were not a well-loved minority there. The term beyond the pale, you've heard that term, right?
I do, but not in the, I have, but not in this context.
Well, it was actually a law passed, I think, under Catherine the Great, to keep Jews away from the border area,
Okay.
to limit their ability to engage in mercantile operation. It may, of course, now they would have said at the time to keep them from being involved in smuggling. I don't know the truth of it, but the point is just an example of discriminatory legislation going way, way, way back. So this hated minority after, and even before World War One, were fleeing the East en masse and moving to Austria, Germany, which were very liberal and very welcoming.
Yeah.
And Eastern Europe in general, Poland, etc. That's why they were there in the first place, to be
Now,
involved.
generally speaking, my knowledge of this is a little lacking, but it's a question I would like to ask. Has the Eastern Orthodox variant of Christianity been more anti-Semitic than the Vatican or Martin Luther's Protestant progeny?
God, I don't know how we would answer that. I would say that in general, the Eastern Orthodox had their own Inquisition. Again, we don't see it publicized. There was a great series of books. The word Cedars was in the title by a Russian author. Some of it's kind of fantasy, but in one of his stand-up speeches in Australia, he speaks very good English. He was going into how the first Inquisition was actually by the Russian Orthodox Church against a score of pagan minorities within Russia, even before persecuting the Jews. So this has been there for a while. But to answer your original question, Bruce, I think
That's you're about the eighth person to tell me to read this series. It's called the Ringing Cedars series.
that's it. The Ringing Cedars. You got it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I have been told by so many people to read this, and I haven't gotten around to it. But you know what? I'm gonna make it a project in 2024. I'm gonna get this done. I've been told it's amazing.
It really is. Well, this guy's original thing, I just first heard this lecture where he's giving it, I think it was in Australia. He's an expert on trees, by the way, an arborist, I think a PhD in that. Went to school in the US, as a matter of fact. It was going into the persecution and into the original nature religions of Russia. He kind of went into that to some extent. But the reason that you don't hear about the Holodomor and you don't hear about the Armenian genocide is very simply that they don't own the media. They don't own publishing houses. They don't tend to be, not that there aren't some in there, they don't tend to be the network executives, and they don't tend to be the financiers who decide what programs are going to get funded to
Yeah.
be on TV and what story is going to be out there on the media. And I'm not trying to sound cynical about this, but it's basically you buy the influence you want to have
Yeah.
within a society. And
There
I would
was
say
there was a Holocaust, like a bona fide Holocaust at the end of World War II, perpetrated on about 8 million Germans, civilians and soldiers as well, which
yes,
nobody ever talks about. They were rounded up and put into concentration camps and tortured and starved and experimented upon and all of these sorts of things.
that is correct. And nobody actually even knows the exact number. There was some of it was done in the East. As far as that which was done in the West, it was in the Rhine Meadow camps. Nice, pretty sounding name on the border between Germany and France. I think of what you would call Alsace-Lorraine area. And a Canadian journalist, James Bach, Bacque, I believe, wrote a book on it. I remember reading it years ago back in the 90s. I think it was called Other Losses. It was based upon a Red Cross report. And they were complaining that Eisenhower wouldn't allow US troops in. I actually saw a TV documentary, I think on PBS, shortly after reading the book, where they were actually interviewing GIs. And this guy talked about, I saw these guys starving. I wanted to throw rations over. I was caught doing it. I was told that I would be courts-martialed if I fed them. And we were all under orders not to feed them. So he said, we had to hear people starving to death, begging for food all night and dying, and clear the bodies out the next day sometimes.
Wow.
And we were not allowed to feed them.
Yeah.
And they were in open air, just in a big mud. Numerically, that I don't even know what the number is. There's not that many Jewish Americans. And golly, I mean, the ones I've known, man, most of them, like sometimes the grandchildren are Presbyterians or Methodists. They don't even,
Yeah.
they're not only not observant, they just don't have, in fact, huge protests on the West Coast against Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip by American Jews.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not like they're a unified force in favor of Zionism. A lot of
Yeah.
Jews totally disown Zionism, but I think we have to be careful not to look for a sole antagonist on the world stage and try to put it
Agreed.
all on that antagonist.
Agreed. What I was leading up to is the roles and personalities in the Russia desk of the State Department, which has been pointed out by other online commentators, is unusually stacked with the grandchildren of people who suffered under the Russian pogroms. So you've got Victoria Nuland. I can't name them all, but there's 4 or 5 of them. Direct blood relatives of grandparents who suffered in the Russian pogroms. You know, it's interesting to me that when you get into these multicultural countries like Canada and the United States, that there wouldn't be what we would call conflict of interest regulations, where maybe it's not that good that you're on this desk because you've got history and bloody history with these people, and maybe it's not that good that you're making these decisions for the American people.
I would say, Bruce, it's sometimes even worse than you think. And I don't know about Canada, but I know in the US, we have had a lot of dual citizens serving in, I think, the Clinton administration, certainly in the Bush administration, big time. And even in the Obama administration, I don't know about Trump specifically, but I know there've been a lot of dual citizens. Now, I don't have a problem with dual citizens being maybe at a lower level, but you put them in decision-making executive positions in a country, you
Yeah.
have to go, who are they serving? The adopted country or the country that they're still a citizen of? I don't know. It's
So
a good question.
one thing that I think a lot of people get wrong is that when they see a concentration of Jewish people in public office or in public voice, let's say, they always assign a kind of nefarious or conspiratorial frame to the picture. But the reality is, if you understand the Torah and what the rabbis have been teaching for centuries, their view on the spiritual life is that the most meaningful spiritual life is one which contributes to the advancement of humanity. So they're predisposed to public office and as a religious mandate in many ways. But when you just see the concentration of Jewish people in power centers, immediately, with the proliferation of anti-Semitic material on the internet, immediately you come to a conspiracy theory. Okay? Now, this is a mixed bag because, I'll say this too, because I'm trying to be fair and level-handed, and we are talking about Russia. But I think at the core of this Russia question is the Jewish question, which is why I'm spending a bit of time on this topic. But what I was getting to is this preponderance of power positions within the Jewish community is not necessarily looked upon as negative, but at the same time, it seems to me as well that this particular population, the Jewish population, is able to produce what I would call absolutely monstrous personalities at a disproportionate level per capita and coming to mind. So when people talk about serial killers, they say, well, it was Jimmy Savile, or it was the Green River Killer on the west coast of the United States killing prostitutes, or Robert Pickton in the BC interior feeding prostitutes to pigs. And his body count some people say it was over 100. He went on for 20 years before they caught him. But the truth is, the greatest serial killers are always in public office. I would have no problem calling Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright serial killers.
I mean, the
Okay?
people who start wars without real justification.
Yes. Yes.
Well,
And
I think that what you're addressing here, I see how people get this, but I wouldn't want a group of Germans running my country if we're a mixed bag country like we are. I wouldn't
Yep.
want a group of Italians running it. We might call it Sicilian mafia if they tried to do it. Not that they're a very tiny part of the Italian American community anymore, but
yeah.
you wouldn't want any group concentrating their power and running over everybody. As Mormons, anybody else that tends to be cliquish, you wouldn't want that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's what tends to come across to some people with the conspiratorial mindset. I think that if you looked at other groups which really value scholarship, I'll give you an example. An Armenian client of mine one time who brought her grandson in for treatment for ADD, a really nice kid, really squared away teenager, just trying really hard to succeed at it. And I said, well, how is it that with this ADD, as bad as it is, and he was on medication for it and all that he still manages to be a decent student? She said, well, we have this custom in Armenian society. And I found it quite charming. I'd never heard this before. When they're young, like toddler in the crib, you put honey on the edge of a book and hand it to them, and they'll suck the honey off it. So they learn to associate books with something good. I thought, well, that's really sweet. I'd never heard of this before. And she said, so we really, really value scholarship. And I was thinking the same thing would be said of Palestinians, the Palestinian diaspora. I mean, they are very educated people,
Yeah.
really dominate, a lot of them in academia and so on. I think of Dr. Daniel Amen, for example, phenomenal, a psychiatric researcher getting into the different types of depression seminars in it and all that. So I think that there's this thing where your group identity becomes a means of group survival. When you're an embattled, you see yourself as an embattled minority. Now, even when you're no longer an embattled minority, but certainly in the US or UK or Canada, they're not an embattled minority. But I think this mentality carries over when you're coming over as part of a diaspora from countries where you were persecuted for generations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that gets built in where if we don't set up an advantage for ourselves or rearrange this society if we're in a commanding position to do so, or have the financial backing to do so by funding the candidates we like, funding the music we want, funding the literature we want, and funding the public discourse through media that we want to see funded, that then we will be mistreated and we have to slant the population in a certain way to do it.
Yeah.
Or slant public policy in a certain way to do it. I think this is what comes out. And I don't know that it's actually a group of people meeting in a smoky room. I don't think that's it. I think it's just kind of a consensus as to how the kind of society where they would have optimal advantage.
Yeah. Yeah. So certainly
rather than deliberate thing.
Yeah. So circling back to Russia, we've got this war in Ukraine. And there's in the Western population, there's a response to this war that it seems to fall between the left-right lines. It's very interesting to me that, you know, we went 4 years without any military conflict under Trump. And then the moment that this so-called liberal administration gets in, we're mired in conflict. Now, there are a number of things that have happened in this conflict that people find very confusing, which feed into a prevailing idea that the West is being collapsed. And so you can look at the Twin Towers coming down in 2001 as the literal and symbolic future of the West. And to my understanding, this is the way these controllers speak. They speak in this manner. So we're throwing all this money at Ukraine at a time when we need infrastructure renewal in North America. Our roads are falling apart. Our bridges are falling apart. Our medical system is dilapidated. Our education system is dilapidated. And a lot of people think that this dilapidation of our systems and institutions is intentional. And it's hard to say it isn't when you see what's going on and where priorities are being put. So I'll give you an example, very, very concrete example. We have situations in Canada now where people die of cancer because they can't be scheduled for their operation soon enough, amidst a publicly funded medical system that is routinely doing sex change operations. You know,
I will go along with what you say about a crumbling infrastructure. There hasn't been investment. There's been a rise, and this is a whole show on its own. The rise of narcissism as a pandemic of narcissistic thinking. You have to go back to Ronald Reagan's days, proposition this, proposition that, which says we, the whatever the heck our generation were called, I guess the baby boomers, post-World War II, immediate post-World War II generation, people in their, say, late 60s to mid 80s by now, come up. We pull up the ladder after us, which we used all these government programs to get there. All these government programs. I mean, actually, it's a generation slightly ahead of us. The people who came out of World War II, they had the GI Bill, all this other stuff, small business loans, just a plethora of, and I'm sure it was the same way in Canada, of government programs, which basically create this middle class in the post-Depression, post-World War II era. Let's pull it all up out of the way because that's costing too much tax money to leave it there for the next generation to climb up the same ladder with a few small economic inputs, like a little subsidy for your education if you served in the military, which now has been cut way back, and some social programs which help the middle class to flourish, like government-backed Federal Housing Administration loans to help you get a mortgage, that sort of thing. So let's pull that up. And we saw it in California in particular, where we got the benefits, but now we're going to vote not to pay the taxes for the next people down the road to get the benefits.
Well, that's
I think And
incredibly, that's
I think this is,
incredibly, go ahead.
I think this is what happened to our infrastructure. It's not
Yeah.
benefiting me. Why should I vote for that road tax?
Well,
Back with it.
you're one of the few baby boomers I've met. So I'm Gen X right after you. I'm 57, born in 66. So you're one of the few baby boomers I've encountered who owns up to that and provides details. I didn't even know about the economic stimulus to create the middle class after World War II. I was ignorant to that. Let's circle back to Russia, okay?
Well, no, this all ties in.
Okay,
So what
continue.
happens is this country are war weary because and you point out quite correctly, Bruce, the Democratic so-called liberal administrations are the quickest ones to get us into war. I swear to you.
Yeah,
Lyndon Johnson gets us deeply involved in Vietnam. Richard Nixon pulls us out. I mean, the conservative says, no, what are we in this war for? It's pointless, time and time again. Barack Obama was one of the biggest warmongers there was. He got us into all kinds of short military conflicts, military engagements.
Yeah.
Donald Trump says, no, we don't want to keep doing that. Let's pull back and take care of ourselves. So there's this mentality, which is one of the things saying, why do we get another foreign war? But I think this is where the propaganda comes out. And I kept hearing this figure, 68 billion a year to subsidize Ukraine. And I'm going, hold on. Let's look at what our subsidies are to the part of the world you're living in now. Our subsidies to Central America, to prosperous countries afloat in a sea of oil and narcotics money coming in. Let's be frank about it.
Yeah.
Probably every other peso earned in Mexico is from the narcotics trade.
Epidemic down here. Epidemic.
Absolutely. And what we're doing is the federal government, our federal government in the US, subsidizes the Central American countries for way more than we're giving to Ukraine. I mean, fantastic amount more. And let's look at the 10 million people that have come over since the Biden administration. I don't hear US conservatives saying, wait a minute, $80,000 per person housing allowance, not to mention free medical, free dental, free education, resettlement bonus, anything you want. Oh, and from the UN, joint funded by the US, a Visa card for $5,000 for each one of these people that crosses the border. Now let's add that figure up. And what we're spending on Ukraine is a drop in the bucket to the money we throw. Oh, and we still give a cash subsidy for environmental mitigation to our wonderful ally and most favored trading nation status ally there, the People's Republic of China. Seriously.
Yeah.
I couldn't make this up.
No.
So if you're looking at wasted money, but all the conservatives harp on, and this is Russian programming, is that one figure. Let's look at that. The sea of wasted money.
Yeah.
Let's pick. Now, here's the argument for spending this. It's very costly to go to war. By analogy, when an imperial Germany was arising in the ashes of World War I in the 1930s and took over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Again, the idea being we got X number of German citizens here, therefore we have a right to invade and make it part of Germany. We will annex it. Yeah. And Czechoslovakia was too weak to fight back. Let's annex Poland.
This is something you've been doing in our off-air conversations that I find fascinating, and I'm going to cue you up to elaborate on it here. There are profound similarities between Vladimir Putin and Adolf Hitler.
Yep.
You want to elaborate on that?
Well, sure. And I'll get into more detail, but the cost, if we had gone in and helped back up the Poles and said, okay, Germany, forget it. You've got your little empire here. As far as taking over Poland, we're not going to allow it. We, the British and Americans, are going to arm the hell out of the Poles, train them. We're going to put troops there. So you, Russia, you, Germany, stay off of Polish territory. Take care of your own houses. You're not allowed to go in and tear this country in half and exploit it.
Mm-hmm.
That would have cost so much less than going to war with Germany 2-3 years later on a wide scale.
Yeah.
You see, intervention early says limit, just like in the Spanish Civil War. We didn't back the Spanish Republicans.
Yeah.
We let the fascists win, who are openly backed by the Luftwaffe, the Condor Legion of the Germans, Italian Air Force and ground troops
Yeah,
and Italian Navy in the Mediterranean. Had we intervened and said, no, get out of here, they have backing from the West, that would have severely limited their ability to do this. So instead, it was used as a training ground. These troops later show up on the Eastern Front and elsewhere.
yeah,
So this is what you get into if you either intervene early or you are forced to intervene later when it's much more costly and much less likely that you're going to win.
yeah,
If the point is to preserve a coalition of similarly minded Western liberal democracies. Now, do I agree with you that they've gone way too far with social engineering and these kooky, crazy anti-family, anti-life initiatives? Oh, yes, of course. I don't want to see drag queen story hour,
yeah,
but at the same time, I don't want to see a gay guy in St. Petersburg or Moscow disappearing because they don't
Yeah.
like his sexual orientation, which
Yeah.
is happening. I don't want to see concentration camps full of people like that. It's not my lifestyle, but hey,
Well, we're in total agreement there. We're in total agreement.
I'm
So
all about tolerance, you know?
now let's circle back to Ukraine. Now, one of the things that has truly perplexed me in this conflict, and it certainly adds fuel to the fire that part of the agenda of this conflict that we're supporting Ukraine in, is the continued dilapidation of the West. And here I'm referring to what now can openly and freely, without recrimination, be called the CIA destruction of Nord Stream 2, which was providing all of the energy to Germany, which is one of our greatest allies, and let's be honest here, the economic engine of Europe. What would the rationale in Biden's White House be for doing that?
Well, I'm not even sure that that is what happened. There's a lot of controversy about what actually happened there. Russia had a very strong incentive to do this also because it had jointly engineered Nord Stream 2 with Germany as a partner to build and maintain this pipeline, which benefited both countries. Russia was increasingly, with the demands of the war, going to be unable to follow through with its sale of natural gas to the same level because its industry was taking a hit as foreign technicians pulled back, foreign support for the oil and gas fields was withdrawn. Foreign technologies, replacement parts to it was cutting production way down, which it is now down quite a bit from what it was
So
in 2022.
Russia is not autonomous in this industry at the level of knowledge base and experts.
No, not at all. And this is, again, the distortion of the Russian economy under Vladimir Putin.
Okay.
And after their very brief experiment with democracy post USSR, Russia's GDP right now is 40% for military aggression. I'm not going to use the word defense because it's not about defending anything. No
Yeah.
one's going to attack Russia. This is about Russia's ability to attack others with impunity and acquire the lands and resources of others with impunity.
Okay.
So what we have here is a distortion where they were depending upon foreign technologists and technologies because instead of developing their own oil field instrumentation and technology, they were busy making more missiles and more deadly battlefield equipment.
Yeah.
You either bought guns or butter with your money. And if you're putting it all into guns, you're out of butter. And this is what happened with Russia.
Just to thread the needle here, is the 40% gross domestic product going into armaments in the Soviet Union and military infrastructure, including personnel, 40% of GDP is outrageous. You know, if the listeners will remember Trump chastising the NATO members for not meeting their 2% GDP
Right.
obligation for defense. But the question that comes to mind is this also a lucrative business for Russia? Are they selling armaments?
This is the only thing Russia really exports besides oil and gas, was selling weapons to everyone from North Korea to, and they've never recognized an arms embargo. They sold it to apartheid South Africa. They sold it to both sides in the Sudan wars. They sell arms to just about anybody.
Okay.
And again, you have to look at who are they aligned with ideologically. And the American right should think about this before jumping on the bandwagon because they like the PR value, the nice avuncular appearance and discussion, the nice calm demeanor of a master of public opinion, which is Vladimir Putin. And Joe Stalin gave great interviews in the 1930s while he'd smoke his pipe and look very thoughtful as he, through an interpreter, answered a Western journalist and put on a good show. So did Mussolini, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
You know, but that doesn't mean they were good guys. So what they're not looking at here, what they're kind of missing is where all of this is headed. So if you're putting all your money into armaments and all your technology goes that way, you're siphoning it off the civilian structure. You're failing to develop yourself. So you depend upon foreign sources for your technology, technologists, and equipment and spare parts.
Yeah.
And I think it was a miscalculation on Putin's part to think that when he invaded, since he got away with so much, like annexing Crimea in 2014, which caused very little censure from the West. And I want to get into the psychological reasons for that with you in a minute here. The idea was, well, nothing will really happen. There will be no response. And I think he was quite surprised. The whole ruling caste at the Kremlin was very surprised when basically the Western technologists and their technology got up and left.
Yeah.
And a lot of very skilled people in Russia also left, so they didn't get drafted.
Right. So, I mean, what we're fleshing out here is basically a thesis that Putin looks attractive to certain people in the West of a conservative leaning, amidst leaders like Joe Biden and
Yes.
Justin Trudeau and Emmanuel Macron, who are, you know, when I look, and Trudeau, I'll focus on Trudeau because I'm Canadian. I grew up under his father's tenure, and his father was equally ridiculous. He was more popular back then because the economic consequences of a widespread social safety net had not settled in yet. So everybody loves the guy that's giving away money, and that's why Trudeau lasted in federal politics for whatever it was. I mean, he went from the late 60s to the early 80s. Intermittently, he was out of office for periods of time, but he was like an ant infestation. Just when you thought you got rid of it with the sugar and the borax, it was. And you know, I grew up in Ottawa, and one thing I don't like is disingenuous people. I don't like it when a leader presents himself to the world as a family man and he's really gay. And this happens quite a bit as well. I think the same is true of his son, Justin. Certainly Barack Obama is gay. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau was gay. I mean, I grew up in Ottawa. My old man used to he was in the Canadian version of the State Department, what we used to call the Ministry of External Affairs back then. And, you know, generally in state departments, there are three divisions. There's a diplomatic, there's an espionage, and there's an economic. My father was an economist, and so he was schlepping all over the world, doing trade deals with other countries on behalf of Canada. But we were fairly well plugged in Ottawa. I played hockey with the son of the chief of the police, and him and my old man got along really well. And they would sit in the stands of a hockey game or a practice, and then the old man would have all kinds of dirt about what's going on in Ottawa. But it was well known that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was gay. And so, and again, there's nothing wrong with that other than present yourself as you are. Don't tell a lie.
Yeah, don't deceive the public with the family man image when that's not who you are. I totally hear you. Yeah. But
Putin,
you have to look at
let me just finish
chosen.
Let me just finish my point here. But, you know, Putin comes in, and to religious people, they look at the guy and they go, okay, this is a leader. And I mean, compared to people like Trudeau and Biden and Macron, he's a fantastic leader. But in reality, which is what we're getting at today, this is a trap. And
Oh, yeah.
this is not good. So I'll
Well, you have
stop
to
there.
remember that Putin is a veteran KGB officer. The KGB were experts, and it wasn't the 13th section, by the way, Bruce. It's the 11th section of the KGB. It was responsible for influencing foreign public opinion, especially buying the foreign media. Now, of course, our media is captive. We know about Operation Mockingbird, the CIA putting out. I saw a really interesting collage effect recently where there were all these journalists saying Taylor Swift is not a psyop, and they were all saying the same talking line.
Yeah.
And it used to be, they called it, I forget the time in the morning, I think it was called the 4:30 a.m. feed, where
Mhm.
the CIA would teletype out to all these journalists and all these wire services, including Reuters, by the way,
Yeah.
what the talking points for the day would be. And they would all be repeated verbatim as
Yeah.
the lead item by all these media talking heads. So it's the same kind of thing. You don't really know what you're looking at, but
News
I think
readers.
I think our response to this corruption is to look for a leader who looks like he's not corrupt, like he means what he says, and he's out for protecting traditional values. Now, what they forget is, and this is because you have a very controlled press in Russia, Vladimir Putin has completely destroyed any opposition press, just like there are no real opposition political parties. There is the pretense of a communist party, which always loses, just to keep the old timers line, give them a chance to go cast their ballot, knowing it won't work.
Yeah.
And that's about the only, and it's a pseudo opposition thing. I think there are maybe 2 members in the Duma who are actually part of the Communist Party anymore.
Okay.
That's how minor they are anymore. Not a real influence in Russian politics at all.
How many members would there be in the Duma?
Man, I don't really know. I should know that figure.
Probably, I'd say
It's
I'm gonna say about 800, because we have about 350 or 360 members of parliament in Canada, and we're a population of about 37 million. Russia is a little over double our population, so I'm gonna say that there's probably about 800 people in the Duma. So that's
and
an
we have like 100 senators and I think 400 and something House members. So that's a combined total of say 540, 550, something like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Well, anyway, what you have was when he was the police chief of St. Petersburg, a massive amount of cocaine came up missing. Nobody in Western media is even looking at this. I mean, a ton of cocaine is worth a heck of a lot of money.
yeah,
And Russia does have a major drug problem. It had it under the USSR, still has it today. Heroin is a big problem in Russia. They're not a pristine society, white as driven snow, not having any social issues at all. Far from it. I sent you the article where in 2017, the family values approach of Vladimir Putin, domestic violence was decriminalized. You can beat your wife,
yeah,
as long as you didn't hospitalize her, you're fine. It's a private matter.
yeah.
She doesn't have a right to call the police on it. You slap her around, you bruise her, cut her up, she's got a bloody nose, police don't even write it up.
Wow. Okay.
This is the kind of policy that should give people pause. Is that what you really believe in? Is that the society you want?
Yeah.
That's where Russia has gone. You look with shock at the fact that in the Islamic world, these suicide bombers and these young men, like when the Iranians were throwing themselves against the wall of Iraqi steel during the, I think it was 11 years long, something like that, Iran-Iraq war.
Yeah.
And a whole generation of Iranian youth was just wasted. They threw these children, I mean, young men, 9, 10, 11 years old at the Iraqi guns, which is hard for me to wrap my mind around.
Yeah.
We go, why would you do that? Well, because they were all promised that they'd be in paradise. They would immediately have 72 virgins, all the other blandishments of paradise for having themselves killed. Likewise, the suicide bombers. So now let's look at the Russian Orthodox Church. It issues a fatwa, not once or twice. I sent you the actual information on it in my emails, where they're promising paradise if you go get even an atheistic, drunk, drug-using Russian who's bailed out of prison to go fight on the front as a prison conscript. I mean, a guy that's in there for child abuse, whatever, he's guaranteed heaven if he dies fighting for the motherland. This is the same mentality, folks. You find it abhorrent in Islamic culture, which I'm not saying all Islamic culture buys into this, but the more radical elements do.
Yeah.
Why don't you find it repugnant when you see exactly the same fanatical idea?
Well, they don't. people
idea.
don't know, George.
Russia-
You're giving people information here that they just don't know.
I mean, it's written right up there in the Moscow Times. Even a Russian source, even in the controlled media there, acknowledges that this is going on. It actually publicized like it's a good thing. Hey, go die for the motherland. You're guaranteed heaven. I'm going, what? That's insane.
Yeah.
But here's a whole country on an official level buying into it. You
Yeah.
have to understand that the Russian Orthodox Church, this bastion of family traditional values, is now entirely run by the KGB. I
Yeah.
mean, the original Russian Orthodox priesthood, after Putin took over, was eliminated. They got a 9mm
Well,
retirement. A lot of them did.
but that's kind of universal, right? I mean, the intelligence agencies in the West are generally have very strong religious connections. I think most of the directors of the CIA have been Knights of Malta, right?
Well, there's a difference between their belonging to a secret society like Knights of Malta and actually going in and taking over the hierarchy of, say,
Yeah.
the Roman Catholic Church in the US or the Mormon Church. They don't do that. You don't basically suddenly have the entire hierarchy of priests and bishops and so on in the Catholic Church disappear and be replaced by CIA members. Otherwise, we would have a fit over it. This is
Yeah.
not cool. That's what happened in Russia. This is what you have to wrap your mind around. This so-called church is a rubber stamp for jingoistic society, an expansionist imperialist society.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
again, these parallels. Now, this is a step further than Adolf Hitler. The Third Reich never succeeded. They tried to form the so-called German church, but it never really took off. People kind of stuck with the religion they had. So it never really had the traction. Whereas this is a
Yeah.
formal rubber stamp of the Russian Orthodox Church
Now,
backing Kremlin policy.
one of the ironies of the similarities between Putin and Hitler is that Putin constantly references Hitler and Nazism as justification for what he's doing. To your knowledge, to what degree have the Nazis taken over the political infrastructure or regions of Ukraine? And why, I'm very curious, I mean, why has that been tolerated? And it's very interesting to me because I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the Ukraine has more places of worship and veneration, places where what the Jews call saints lived and died, high learned rabbis they don't use the word saint. I forget what the word is, but it's sort of the highest status you can achieve in terms of consciousness demonstration in the Jewish religion. And the vast majority of them, these burial sites are in the Ukraine. Did you know that?
Well, no, I've never seen that. When you
Yeah.
consider that the population of Jews in the Ukraine was never more than about 2.5%, and the Khazarian Empire was scattered to the winds in 975
Yeah.
when Russia invaded from one side and the Persians were threatening to invade from the other. And that's how they ended up. Many of them ended up in Western Europe and even fled as far as the Sephardim. Well, I guess some of the Sephardim came from the Middle East too, but a lot of them ended up as far as Spain. So
Yeah.
that's where they came from because this empire was destroyed. So the Khazarians haven't been there for a long time.
Well, no. So one of the curious things about Judaism is that it doesn't proselytize or seek converts, and every religion does in some way, shape, or form. Like if you were to go on a trip to India and walk into an ashram or walk into a Hindu temple, you would be engaged, and people would say, would you like to try Hinduism? Same thing with Buddhism. We know Christianity is, if you're not with us, you're going to hell. So it's pure proselytization. But the Jews don't proselytize. Yet right smack in the middle of this population and dominant in Jewish culture and Jewish politic and Jewish presence in the world is this huge chunk of Ashkenazis, which are not really Jewish, because to really be Jewish, you have to trace your bloodline right back to Adam, more or less. Um, you know, so
Oh, you mean back to Palestine? Sure. Yeah.
well, I would say right back to Abraham or Adam, right? Now, there was a very curious book that I read a few years ago that came out of the Billy Meyer camp, the Play Iron camp in Switzerland, and it was called The Talmud of Emmanuel. Do you know anything about this?
No, I've heard you mention it before. Do go on.
Well, it was alleged to be the true teachings of Christ in his own words. And there's quite a backstory. The Palestinian fellow who found it, his family was murdered in a refugee camp. And the Billy Meyer camp says that this wasn't, they wiped out the entire refugee camp to cover up the murder of that one guy. Um, and So, but for about the first third of the Talmud of Emmanuel, it's all bloodline, begat, 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 begat. And so what I'm getting at here is,
There's a lot of that in the Old Testament too.
yeah, so it's, and again, it's also, the religion also pivots around a blood covenant with God. So the blood is integral, right? And
Yeah.
so we've got this huge population of Ashkenazis, which, I mean, technically, by their own religious laws, they're not Jews.
Well, do you see how crazy this whole thing has gotten and the extreme manipulation of Western public opinion? On the one hand, we're supposed to look askance at Ukraine because it did, for a very long time, practice religious tolerance. You see, this is why in Western Europe, for instance, you wouldn't find a lot of Jewish sites. It's not that there weren't prominent Jews. Oh, for instance, Benjamin Disraeli. Okay.
Yeah.
In the West, there were very accomplished Jews. I'm not saying they all were, but I mean, what I'm saying is you don't find shrines to them, even though a lot of their writings that I think are sacred to Jews today, the whole set of writings, which is apart from original writings that we'd find in overlapping the Tanakh with the Old Testament,
Yeah.
were written since then. And yet there are no sites. Well, the reason there aren't any sites is because there was one sort of pogrom after the other in the West. Ukraine was kind of unique, and basically nobody wanted to go and do that. And possibly because the area had been overrun by this group and that group for so many times, it changed hands. The territory had so many times over the years.
Yeah.
And part of the, I think, Polish-Lithuanian Confederacy at one time, part of Russia another time, just here and there. So they'd all been, and had been an independent state for a long time as well.
Okay.
So I think that's the reason those sites were left on. It's not that they were favored there. These are very old places. Most of that population is no longer there.
Yeah.
I mean, they're a very tiny minority, just like they are through the rest of Russia.
Is there this presence of Jewish counsel or Jewish advice in the immediate circle of Vladimir Putin, the way Washington seems to be circumscribed by Jewish influence?
Well, Vladimir Putin was in Klaus Schwab's Young Leader program, as was your Pierre Trudeau, Angela Merkel. I think Kamala Harris was also in it. I'm pretty sure Joe Biden was also a member of the World Economic Forum. And
I just quickly want to point out that the World Economic Forum was begun in 1972, and Klaus Schwab was appointed by Henry Kissinger. Please continue.
Yes, indeed he was. And I don't look at them as necessarily a Zionist group. They're simply a group of very elite, very wealthy individuals who want to push their objectives onto the rest of the world and basically don't have any use for the other 99% who are not the wealthy elite, for lack of a better way to put it. So they have their unique policies based on all of that, on privilege and wealth. But he definitely came out of that. I mean, he was one of probably, I don't know, probably 5,000 or 6,000 people of the rank of colonel in the KGB. It was a huge organization. You have to understand, the KGB was not like the CIA. They had, I think, something like 50,000 members at one time. I mean, it was way bigger than the CIA at a comparable time in history.
Yeah.
So you had a pretty huge officer corps there too. So he came out of that. And I do know that Henry Kissinger was a regular visitor to the Kremlin right up until his death.
Yeah, yeah,
And so people in the World Economic Forum were certainly interfacing with the Kremlin to play its part. Now, I think he hasn't been invited, or they haven't had too many Russian delegates attending Davos, attending the Bilderberg meetings now that WEF is overtly leading
yeah,
the Bilderberg meetings. But it's not like there's not Russian involvement in it. It certainly is. It's universal.
yeah,
Bilderberg is not leaving out any particular country, including China.
yeah.
These
Now,
people are not an alternative to the New World Order. They're just New World Order A versus New World Order A prime. They're all part of the same plan.
indeed, indeed. Now, in the interview with Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin explicitly says he has no designs on Poland, and all theories about a reforming Soviet Union are Western propaganda, basically. He didn't use those words, but I can fairly easily summarize what he said without distorting. Now, I believe it's your position that that's an outright lie, and there are documents coming out of the Kremlin, kind of like, but, countries do these plans, and sometimes they come into effect and sometimes they don't, right? Because intelligence agencies and state departments, their job is to answer what if questions and to do analysis of it. So one example would be the 7 countries in 7 years plan that was written up in the State Department in the 80s.
Yep.
And
Yep.
but it sat for 2 decades, and then they decided to start executing it under Bush Jr. Okay. Now, please elaborate on this, that there is documentation in the Soviet Union. There are white papers, there are policy papers coming out of the Kremlin, and Putin is a signatory to them, that do talk about an expansionist Russia.
Now, I have sent you lots of documentation where Russian generals, Russian diplomats, and leaders, including Medvedev, who was prime minister briefly with Putin, was the real power under him, and later was vice premier, so to speak, the equivalent to a vice president under Putin, have openly stated their desire that basically Poland will be next. They're not kidding about that. I don't think they're saying this emptily. There's a difference. So we're talking about external consumption through useful idiots like Carlson, and internal consumption for the Russian people. What the Russian people are hearing is, we're going to rebuild the Soviet Union. We're going to get back Russian honor. There's a sense of our honor has been besmirched, just like Germany's honor was besmirched by the Treaty of Versailles. And they had to get a strong nationalistic leader to regain their masculinity, to, avoid this national castration.
Let's stop right there and let me ask, has their honor been offended? Did Putin in 2001 sincerely want to join the West full on, get into NATO and everything, and they were snubbed? Has there always been this contempt for Russia in the American establishment?
I think Russia was snubbed on getting into NATO, if it was a sincere question. I don't know if it was or not. And I think that the thing that's going on here is, even at that time, academics, including his own mentor, Alexander Dugin, was calling for a rebirth, a re-emergence of the USSR very clearly. And Dugin is the most consistent advisor to Vladimir Putin, and always has been.
Yeah. Who killed him?
I think his daughter was assassinated, and I think it was probably meant for him. She just happened to get in the car.
Right.
And crank the engine. I think he's still alive. I could be wrong. I don't know what happened to Alexander Dugin.
Okay.
Somebody could look that up. But he certainly was he was the architect of the policy, just like Paul Wolfowitz was the architect of the PNAC policy that general elaborated upon, where they were going to do seven countries in 5 years, some sort of insane plan like that in the US. I think the difference is, as far as public pronouncements versus real intentions, you have to remember that right up, think about, I take you back in your mind,
He's
Bruce,
alive. He's
Okay,
alive and he's still a fairly young man. He's only 62.
that's what I thought. Okay. But if you'll think back to February of 2022, right until the day of the invasion, the Russians were denying that they were going to invade.
Yeah,
So again, public pronouncements are not always truthful.
yeah,
And the US has done the same thing. I mean, you leave a lot of ambiguity sometimes. Sometimes you outright lie as to what your intentions are. You don't want the other side to start preparing if you made a formal announcement. Who does that? Generally, countries don't do that.
yeah,
So the statement that they don't want to do this or that is, to me, meaningless. What I look at is what are their behaviors and what are their internal pronouncements? What are the books that Putin has written where he outlined rebuilding the Russian Empire, rebuilding the USSR? Did they feel snubbed? Yes, I do. I think Russia was humiliated by the way Western countries came in under Yeltsin and stripped assets from the country during the brief period when it was
yeah,
in chaos after the fall of the USSR. I think
yeah.
that had to be humiliating. The West should have
We do.
reined these countries in.
And this is something that has to be stated because we can't overlook anybody's angst. And
Right.
although the left is out of balance right now, the causative forces for their angst are legitimate. There, so I peg the Cold War as the beginning of the end of the West. We were almost better in conflict than we were at peace. And it seems to me that we became an empire of looters after the Cold War. It's just one thing after another, and we started looting and reshaping the world the way we wanted to shape it. And it is true that under Yeltsin, Russia was looted.
Yep.
You know, they went in and got all the precious resources, the oil, and a lot of them were American or European billionaires. And Putin came in and he took it all back. And you know, and to be honest, I applaud him for that. There's very few countries in the world that could do that. You know, stand
Well,
up.
well Putin is kind of like the mob boss claiming his territory. He gets, and figures differ on this. They say anywhere from 10 to 50%, just like we know that Joe Biden got 10% as the big guy, and all these deals done by the various, like Rosemont Partners, et cetera, all these different organizations the Biden family was involved in.
Yeah,
There was a huge amount, any deal that goes down in Russia. And as a matter of fact, Elon Musk joked about it one time when somebody asked him if he was the richest man in the world. He said, "Oh, no, I don't hold a candle to Vladimir Putin. He's the richest man in the world."
yeah,
And the journalist was kind of like, "What?" Well, the Western media hadn't covered it. Every deal that goes down in Russia, he gets a chunk of.
yeah,
So he's the capo.
yeah,
He is the head honcho. He's the capo involved in a mafia state. And that's what Russia is, a mafia state.
yeah,
That's what you have to understand. All this crap about family values, the reason tanks and trucks were abandoned full of ammunition that couldn't reach the front when they were trying to seize Kiev in the offensive in February 2022 is because the fuel had already been sold on the black market.
oh
A
my,
lot of the ammo had been sold on the black market. Everything that wasn't nailed down, the tires had been sold. I know
wow,
of tire companies, you could buy a great Russian made tractor tire. I know a lot of people in agriculture around here at surplus places and so on, which we thought were military surplus.
yeah,
The whole United States was buying, quote, Russian military surplus for 20 years, thinking it was actual surplus. It was reality shit that was stolen
yeah,
by supply officers, and everybody in the Russian military was doing it. So when they get out to try to invade another country in mass, not like a little reaction like Georgia, but a massive
yeah,
invasion where you're putting 150, 180,000 troops in the field at once, they find that the tires blow up, the tires haven't been rotated, tires have been sitting out in the sun, or they were subpar. The good stuff has already been sold to foreign buyers.
yeah, yeah,
You're driving there on 50-year-old tires have been sitting there in a warehouse or sitting out on in open air.
yes,
So this is what happened. This is how corrupt this system is. And you're saying these people are promoting family values. What family values? Family values of greed, corruption, and theft from your
yeah,
own country. These are, excuse me, guys, conservatives, these are the family values you promote? Seriously?
Yeah.
I don't think so. You're talking about a very corrupt fascist regime. Now, this is not to say that the Ukraine, before the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, where Viktor Yanukovych went back to Russia, he was the head of a whole bunch of Russian Orthodox, Russian oligarchs that ran Ukraine with an iron fist before that.
Yeah.
In the post-breakup years, they were supposedly an independent nation, but in reality, Yanukovych ran it, and the Russian oligarchs ran it, and the Ukrainian people wanted ties with the West. They wanted EU membership. The oligarchs wanted them to join the CIS, I think the Council of Independent States, which Putin was heading up, which was their equivalent to an EU over there. And rather than recognizing this aspiration, the leadership didn't, and that's what fomented the revolt. With or without US support, it would have gone over.
Very, very simple question as we wind up here. A couple things I want to cover before we close out. Number one, you called Tucker Carlson a useful idiot, which puts you in the same category as Hillary Clinton. Is there anything you want to say to separate yourself from Hillary Clinton?
I like a lot of Tucker Carlson's interviews and so on. I think sometimes he does a lot of what Western journalists do. You get a great interview, you know it's going to be a hit, it's going to put you up there, the ratings as a journalist, and you don't really think critically about what you're asking like you would a domestic politician.
Yeah.
You kind of suck up to the guy you're interviewing because that makes a great interview and it brings him out more. He'd get a little defensive and might hide stuff, might not be as forthcoming if you interviewed him the same way that he might have interviewed, say, a liberal candidate in the US.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can like Carlson some days, not like him others. I reserve the right to do that. I've enjoyed some of his pieces, but some of it, he's just out there.
Well,
this is one of them.
Look, he may have missed the mark a little bit with Putin and, created a little bit of more of a Putin fan base in the West. And he certainly made Western leadership look stupid. I mean, Putin did that himself. I mean, here you have a man who goes to the ballet, who can quote poetry, philosophy, and this is what a statesman is supposed to be. And then you look at Justin Trudeau. Never missing a gay pride parade. He literally goes to 24, even smaller cities like Halifax. The prime ministerial jet is flying there to spend the day and the photo op. And it's just ridiculous compared to somebody like Putin.
So why is somebody like Trudeau or Biden fawning after this tiny minority of people who call themselves transgender? I don't know. To tolerate them is one thing. I don't want anything bad to happen to them, but to promote this as a lifestyle, as the center of your culture, to make it a big thing in the military, to promote gayness and promote transgender. I don't understand why it needs to be promoted. If you're tolerating it, you say we're an open society, you can be this and join the military. That's enough. You don't need to push it on people.
Agreed.
This is hard to understand.
Agreed.
And so Russia goes the other way.
My final question is, does the West really care about Ukraine, or are we just using them for our own political ends as well?
I think the US cares about bringing all the independent countries into the defensive alliance, which is NATO's original intent. I was very disappointed to find that NATO was openly involved in Afghanistan and all these NATO countries. I think what people in the US and the conservatives tend to lose sight of is getting the natural resources we want, getting the military cooperation we want, like when we wanted to go invade Afghanistan under Bush, which I don't approve of, but we did. We relied on NATO allies to help us, and they were a big help. We had a lot of French, including French Foreign Legion, British Dragoons, all kinds of people there, Canadians, all members of the NATO alliance were big parts of that.
Yeah.
And if we're going to ask them to do that, we have to honor our commitments and our treaties. Well, we entered into a treaty, the Budapest Memorandum of 1992, where the US, the UK, Russia, and Ukraine were all parties, where it was agreed that the borders of Ukraine, as they were in 1992, including Crimea, would remain as they were, and its sovereignty was guaranteed from foreign intervention in exchange for Ukraine's giving up what was the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world.
Yeah.
Had Ukraine held on to those, nobody would have invaded it. for
Yeah.
fear of setting off World War III.
Yeah.
So they gave this up for security. We have, as we often do, turned our backs on somebody we promised to support.
Yeah.
Because somebody like Trump could come in, or anybody could come in, any candidate, and say, oh, this is too expensive. Never mind all the other stuff. We'll cut this line out of the budget and quit supporting
Absolutely.
them.
Absolutely. George, this has been a fantastic conversation. We're going to do this on the regular now. I'm Bruce McDonald. This has been McDonald in the Morning, and we will talk to you again fairly soon.